Okay, so the next presenter we have is Jessica Morley. She's, well, one of my colleagues now at the Yale Digital Ethics Center. She's going to be talking to us about using algorithms in clinical decision makings and whether there is or not a threat to the patients and the doctors or the clinicians' autonomy.
Thanks. Hi everyone. As you've just heard, I'm Jess Morley. I'm a postdoc associate at the Yale Digital Ethics Center. But if you can't tell from my voice, that's not where I originally hail from. I have spent the last 10 years of my life back home in Oxford. And this is a sort of subset of a far wider project looking at how do you deploy algorithmic clinical decision support software in a clinical environment in a way that is sort of what I would say technically feasible, socially acceptable, and ethically justifiable and legally compliant. If you have no idea what I'm talking about with regards to clinical decision support software, fear not, all will become clear. So just as a very brief overview, I will quickly explain what clinical decision support software is and why it is appealing from a sort of policy and practical perspective. I'll talk a little bit then about, this is really where the focus will be, about why and does it and why it does clinical decision support software threaten the sort of therapeutic relationship between patients and clinicians, particularly from a perspective of autonomy and epistemic certainty, and why that might matter from a bigger perspective. And then towards the end, I'll give some overview of the types of things that I think can be done to try and minimize those challenges or to try and overcome those challenges. So very briefly, what is clinical decision support software? If you aren't a health informatics nerd like me and haven't spent an awful long time studying what this is, it is a very old concept. It has existed since at least the 1970s, but the general idea is that you can provide a healthcare provider that's typically a clinician, but it might increasingly be a nurse or a radiographer. They will provide the piece of software with some specific characteristics of an individual patient. The software will then in the background match those characteristics to information that is stored in its clinical knowledge base, and then use that to present the clinician back with some information about that specific patient. For example, a diagnosis, a warning or prognosis, or a recommended treatment. To give a really basic example of that, if I was to go into my general practice, so that's your primary care provider in US speak, back home, there would likely be a warning sign that would flag up on my computer's clinical decision support software, would flag up on my GP's screen saying, Jessica is female, she's over the age of 25, you should remind her to go to cervical screening. That is a very basic form of clinical decision support software. The idea is that by providing the right information at the right time, in the right format through the right channel, can reduce the amount of uncertainty that is faced by clinicians when they are making decisions. The idea is to try and reduce the amount of cognitive overload that a clinician might be facing at any one point in time in order to make decision-making higher quality, by which is normally meant more consistent or more in line with evidence base, with the ultimate aim being that that will therefore make care more cost-effective, more safe, more consistent, and more efficient. So that's a basic form of clinical decision support software. But what we're really seeing now, and what the basis of what I'm going to talk to you about today, is what we call algorithmic clinical decision support software. So this is stuff, the same basic idea. We take a patient base of information, we match it with a knowledge base, and we present the clinician with some information based on that knowledge base. But instead of it being pre-programmed, we are instead using an algorithm, typically some form of machine learning, in the background. So there's a very big difference between the clinical decision support software that was built in the 1970s and has been in use since then, which is what we typically call an expert system. The idea being that it's all pre-programmed based on knowledge that was already known. And all that is being done is prompting the clinician to remember something that they should have already been aware of. If you take, for example, a clinical guideline and put it into a computerized form, that is a sort of example of a basic form of clinical decision support. Algorithmic clinical decision support instead, which is this here on the right, is using a complex algorithm. It's trained, it's something that's learning, it is increasingly unsupervised. So you might give the algorithm, the entire electronic health record basis of the whole country. This is what happens in England. There are 58 million patients in England. You give a machine learning algorithm access to all of that data and all of that record, and it will learn patterns in there that are previously unknown. So that may be things to do with factors associated with risk. So who is most likely to become ill from a particular condition, or who is most likely to react best to a specific type of drug. But it's new information. It's also then a two-way reasoning center. So instead of being a sort of one-way system where you just get a flagged piece of information up, instead it's like an ask and answer session. So anybody who has now interacted with an LLM, so whether that be ChatGPT or Claude, is a bit more familiar with this concept now. So you're asking a question and it's giving you back information. So it might be a case of asking, for example, the system, patients like this, what is the most effective treatment? And then it will give you back a series of answers rather than just prompting. Increasingly, it may also be type of software used in, for example, an emergency situation. Increasingly, we see algorithmic clinical decision support software deployed in the contexts of things like sepsis and stroke, where we need to make, or clinicians need to make decisions very quickly based on an enormous amount of information that they may not have time to process, and this contributes to cognitive overload. There's also a degree of what if scenario planning. So rather than it just being, this is what is happening now, it is a case of thinking through, if we change this one particular variable, what will happen in the future? So patient A is currently at X% risk of developing disease Y in the future. If we tell them to do this, if, for example, we tell them to increase the amount of exercise they do or to stop smoking, what is the chances that that risk is going to come down of them developing that disease in the future? And it's also inferential. So this is not information that is set in stone. We are not talking about things that is hard-based rules. Instead, it's things that it's explicitly using causal inference. So it is explicitly inferring, if you are a cisgendered female with brown hair and green eyes, you are most likely to be at risk of this, but that is all inference. So why is this appealing? Why are we seeing huge amounts of money being funneled into this concept all over the place, in the EU, in the UK, in the US, but also increasingly in places like India? I was on a panel this morning talking about the ways in which this type of software might be deployed in India. The idea underpinning the whole concept is this idea of a learning healthcare system. This being that we take real world data that is recorded in a clinic where a patient is treated or diagnosed. That is then used to train computational models like I've just described. Then that is translated into tools to help clinicians make better decisions at the point of care via clinical decision support. And then the outcomes of that intervention via the clinical decision support is fed back into the system so that the healthcare system can ultimately learn how to do things better. The idea then being that this will make healthcare more sustainable, or achieve what is sometimes referred to as the triple aim, which is this idea that you can simultaneously improve outcomes, improve the experience of care, and reduce per capita cost. This is wildly appealing to all healthcare systems at the moment because of how much healthcare systems are struggling to cope with increased capacity. So basically increased demand from aging populations and populations that are sicker, especially in the wake of COVID-19. So why is this problematic, particularly from a perspective of autonomy? There are several different reasons, which I'll talk through now. The first one is probably the one that people are most familiar with if you have spent any time thinking about sort of AI ethics or digital ethics in general, is because data quality and algorithmic capacity. So data quality in healthcare is actually extremely poor. It's really important to remember that any healthcare data that is generated and sort of collected in a clinic was never collected for the purpose of training an algorithm. It was only ever collected and recorded for the purpose of helping a clinician remember what has happened with a specific patient in the past. That means it's often poor. There are often errors in it. So to give an example, just so that brings that to life a little bit more for people who are non-familiar, when we were doing some modeling back in COVID-19, we wanted to see which patients were most likely at risk of negative outcomes from COVID. One particular patient group that we kept repeatedly seeing was cisgendered men in their 70s who were pregnant. That makes no clinical sense in any way, shape, or form. What it transpires when we did some investigation was that the SNOMED code, so the electronic health record code, that is used to record fetus and poorly knee are basically almost exactly the same. So if you're a busy clinician and you're typing away and you've got this man in front of you who's got a bad knee, you accidentally code them as having a fetus. So there are these problems all over the place to do with data quality. Then there are issues that people are probably familiar with to do with things like bias. Healthcare data is almost all, it's about 80% generated on Caucasian people, and a lot of that is also men. So we have an enormous problem with regards to the sort of just the epistemic basis, just the knowledge base that these systems are being trained on is often inaccurate. It's inscrutable because we don't know what these things are taking into account. They might be making wildly sort of erroneous decisions about correlations and assuming that they are causation instead. And there's also massive problems with bias. There are then issues to do with the validation and the evaluation of these systems. So effectively, if we are taking epistemic certainty in clinical decision making and the autonomy of the clinician, that comes from this idea that the clinician has taken an enormous amount of time training. They have then taken that knowledge and applied it in the context of clinical practice, and they are combining evidence of safe treatments that have been done through clinical trials, etc., combining it with both their practical knowledge that they have gained through an enormous amount of training at school, and then practical knowledge, and merging all of those three concepts in order to make decisions upon which they are certain are both accurate and ethically justifiable for the patient. In the context of algorithmic clinical decision support software, what we are seeing is that entire process is broken down because we don't know how to validate and evaluate the sort of outputs of these systems. We have no way of knowing whether or not they're accurate. There is a problem that we are seeing emerge enormously where increasingly algorithmic clinical decision support software is trained on spurious information, so it's trained on poor quality data. It is then not properly evaluated. It is then deployed in a live environment, and clinicians do not necessarily have the skills or the experience to know how to interpret the outputs of these systems, and instead are expected to take them sort of for granted. There's a concept called automation bias, which is the assumption that the computer is always right. We're then beginning to see that there's a shift in the way in which these systems are perceived. So rather than being seen as an assistant, so a sort of assistance, that's the decision support, they are in fact being increasingly placed on a higher level of epistemic sort of authority that may increasingly override the authority of the clinician. There is an assumption that because this is clinical decision support software is taking into account a wider range of points, it is therefore more likely to be more accurate and more right. And at the same time, whereas that sort of assumption is happening, we know that the actual sort of validity of the decision making in that system is not necessarily that high because of these problems to do with data and validity. From a patient perspective, we are then also seeing areas and ways in which these types of software might present a bit of a threat to the autonomy of the patient. And there's just three ways in which that is happening. First of all, changing what counts as evidence of illness. So if I go to my doctor right now, if anybody on this call goes to their doctor right now, you will describe the physical sensations of your body. So you will describe, I don't feel like myself, my child is not behaving well, it's not behaving like they normally would, I have had a headache for 3 days, I feel nauseous, etc., etc. But some of that information that you are describing is non-recordable. It is based purely on the haptic sensations of your body. It is based purely on your knowledge of yourself and the functioning of your environment and of your body. A very large majority of that is not recorded in an electronic health record. An electronic health record, or in stuff that comes from your wearables, I don't know why I'm sharing you this because this is an analog watch, but imagine it was an Apple Watch, or your phone. is purely quantitative. It is not qualitative. It is not recording whether or not you feel well, you feel like yourself, you feel happy, etc. Instead, it is only reporting or recording quantitative metrics. So therefore, the only type of information that is included as a definition of illness is quantitative information. So what happens if you are a patient and you go into your doctor and you say, I do not feel well, I have X, Y, and Z. The doctor then types into a clinical decision support software, or indeed the patient is doing this themselves via an app, for example, and the thing comes back and says there's nothing wrong with you. Who is right in that scenario? Is it the patient who genuinely believes that there is something wrong with themselves or their child, or is it the algorithm that has only based its information on a very small amount of information? Now, to give an insight into the way in which this changes behavior, there have been a number of clinical studies or clinical trials done that look at what happens when a clinician makes a decision based on all of the information that they have about a patient. So that's including things like how the patient is body language is presenting, for example, versus what happens when they base their decision purely on the output of a clinical decision support software, which has a far smaller range of information. By and large, when the clinician only has access to the information that a clinical decision support software would have, the algorithm makes better decisions. It's more accurate than the clinician. When the clinician has access to all of the range of information, including all of the human sensation type information, the human clinician makes a better decision or is more accurate than the algorithm. So there is definitely something in the importance of that more semantic or that more qualitative types of information. It's also changing what counts as good patient behavior. So anybody who's ever spent any time thinking about Parsons' theory of the good patient, this is essentially the idea that you are a good patient if you become sick through no fault of your own, and you do everything that is in your power to make yourself well again. Now, what we are seeing in an algorithmic world with a clinical decision support software is we are basically shifting this from a here and now perspective to a future perspective. So we are now essentially saying, if you become unwell in the future because you ignored the heeding or the warning of a predictive model, then that is your fault. You did not listen to the warning that the predictive model said that you were going to become sick in the future unless you did X, Y, and Z. You are now ill through your own fault because you did not listen to the warning. That does not take into account any of the factors to do with what we would call the social determinants of health. So things to do with whether or not the patient can actually act on the information or the advice that was given by the decision support software, including whether or not that was actually tailored to them. And ultimately, all of this sort of changing the ways in which we are thinking about what a patient has the right to decide about their own care, what clinicians are making the decision about, is changing the fundamentals of caring by introducing new power dynamics. So where we have designed clinical care around this very healing therapeutic relationship between a patient and a clinician, we have now mediated that through the introduction of software, which is by and large designed by private third parties over whom we have no accountability and control. And that's disrupting the whole power dynamic. So how do we change this? What are the sort of things that we can start thinking about in order to sort of mitigate some of these risks? Well, my first point is to say to you that I think we need to redefine what the aim is with clinical decision support software. So if we go back to that beginning point that I made, this idea being that we want to deploy this software in order to create a learning healthcare system, that's this idea that we are predicting everything at all times and we are monitoring everything and we are trying to use as much data as physically possible in order to make every single decision or in order to predict everything. That is what I would call an information want. It is an assuming that more information is necessarily better. Instead, I think we should be refocusing our attention on the use of clinical decision support software only on an information need. An information need is meeting these two criteria where there is a very clear information purpose. So I know as a clinician, as a healthcare system, as a patient, why I need to know this very specific piece of information at this specific point in time. And that information is available and is known to contribute to a specific outcome that meets that information purpose. So I know that if I have this piece of information, I achieve this outcome, and there is evidence to support this. That is what we should be designing clinical decision support software to achieve, rather than on this basis of assuming that more information is always right, and therefore assuming that there is a one-to-one relationship between an increase in the amount of information available and an increase in improvement in outcomes. I'm going to stop now so we can open up to conversation.
I'm wondering, one thing I think you mentioned is that the effects that these systems could have on the clinician, the decision
Mhm.
making.
Mhm.
Um, has there been any studies done or anything like that where they've seen disparities with doctors doing it, doctors not using the CCSD system versus the ones that are using it?
Yeah, so that's the type of study that we would really like to see being done, where we do a comparison between what happens when you have a clinician who has the system versus when you have a clinician who doesn't have the system. Unfortunately, for a multitude of reasons, mostly I think because it's expensive and complicated, very few of those types of studies have actually been done. Instead, we tend to see these slightly quirky studies where they are using different versions of the software, for example. But the only studies that I do know of where they have looked at with versus without is what I was saying in my discussion, where they have what does the clinician make a decision based purely on their own, and then what does the clinician make a decision when they have the software available to them. And what we actually show is what those studies have shown is that all clinicians of all seniority are really prone or really vulnerable to that automation bias problem that I was mentioning. So what we tend to see, sorry, I always make symbols appear because I talk too much with my hands. But what we see with that is that even if a clinician has been certain in their answer, they will about 75% of the time change their mind once they have seen the output of the clinical decision support software. And that includes when they have done trials where the clinical decision support software is deliberately wrong. So even when the software is deliberately giving the clinician to the wrong answer, there is still a pretty high chance that the clinician will change their mind. It varies slightly depending on the experience level of the clinician. So more junior clinicians are slightly more vulnerable than more experienced clinicians. But there is definitely building evidence that they make a quite big difference to that sort of cognitive workflow that clinicians normally go through.
Wow, yeah, that's actually very concerning. The last piece that you just mentioned, that's very
Mhm.
concerning. And I'll hand it off to Eric after this, but that's was making me wonder, like it seems like if I was the patient and the doctor told me this, like, yeah, I think it's A, but the system thinks it's B, I'm gonna go with B because I think whatever. I'm gonna be like, that's not okay.
Mhm.
Um, and my point is like I would trust the system less, and I'm not an expert, and the expert is trusting the system more than himself or herself.
Yeah. And the real concern that we as of yet do not know how to mitigate is in the context of medical liability and medical negligence. So the way in which we currently deal with that is you have a gold standard of care. Um, and then you basically, if the clinician has deviated from the gold standard of care, they are at risk of being considered to be liable or negligent if something goes wrong. And then if the case goes to trial, you would see a comparison. You would basically get a host of doctors' peers, and they would say, in the same scenario, would you have made the same decision based on the same information that you had available? The problem that we now are facing is what happens when it is the algorithm that becomes the gold standard of care, against which we are performance monitoring the clinician, and or do we say in that scenario, was would a different algorithm have made the same decision based on the same information, or are we saying is it a clinician? So the whole thing is sort of thrown up in the air because you've now got this mediating partner that nobody really knows how to build into that sort of workflow or relationship.
Yeah. Thanks on that last point. It does seem like maybe from a clinician perspective, you might feel less at risk of being held liable if you follow the software than if you deviate from it.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was going to ask about the redefined aims because they're pretty strong, right? Those conditions are not going to be met a lot. So I was thinking, and that made me also think about, you kind of described the ideal study where maybe you have a random assignment into clinicians with and without the ACDSS. So I was imagining 3 different types of ways of evaluating the value of using CDSS, including maybe cases that don't meet your high standards for when it should be used. Right, so you could say something like, well, look, if we did a good randomized clinical trial and in this range of conditions, when the CDSS is there, even if it doesn't meet the standards you described, it turns out the outcomes are better. So then we should use CSS, right? So you got a kind of short-term utilitarian evaluation. We say we set aside the standards you described as long as there's justification for thinking it's going to be in the interests of the patient. And then I kind of imagine maybe you're saying, like, no, it should be a higher standard than that on one or maybe one of 2 grounds. And I'm just wondering what you think about this, right? So, okay, so maybe even if the outcomes would be worse without CSS, we still shouldn't use it, right? Either one, on some kind of non-utilitarian ethical grounds, like it's less fair to patients from disadvantaged groups, because even though overall the outcomes would be better, the bad ones disproportionately fall on less privileged patients, right? That'd be one kind of ground. Or another kind of ground might be in terms of some kind of long-term utilitarian risk, like even if it would be better in the short term for the patients, right? If they implement a CDSS, in the long term, it undermines clinicians' expertise. It undermines the doctor-patient relationships in general, and so they should be avoided on those grounds. So I guess this is a very complicated way of just responding to the fact that you seem to have a very stringent set of criteria for applying CDSS and seeing whether you really want to stick with that stringency and on what grounds, even if there would be better outcomes with CDSS.
Yeah, sure. Great question, and really interesting and important challenge. So also that challenge comes up a lot in a sort of slightly simpler way, which is essentially if you have a scenario where you have a population who has no access to a clinician currently, so they are, or we know that the standard of care for that particular hospital or that particular treatment is really poor. Do we essentially say that we still won't deploy AI if it's not 100% accurate because it's not right? Or do we say that actually the gains of deploying something that maybe doesn't work 100% of the time is still better than there being no person in time, this sort of balancing of risk? And there is at the moment, there is absolutely no clear answer to that. And I want to spend an enormous amount of time thinking about it, but haven't yet had the chance. In your specific sort of question with regards to whether or not I would stick very stringently to my criteria, my answer is actually no. I think those criteria, I put them there more to do with the aim, because I think we should be looking at them before we make decisions to say, for example, we're going to predict something just for the sake of predicting it. Just because we have access to this piece of information, we can deploy it in a clinical decision support software and predict that this particular outcome is going to happen without having thought through all of the benefits or harms that might happen as a result of that. So I think where I would deviate from those very, very strict criteria being in place would be if we have a general, very good justification for why it is better to be tying in these types of systems. So if we have an idea that there is a better outcome because of this, then I think even if we did not meet those particular types of criteria, then I think it is okay to justify them. Where I think we need to make sure that they are always in place, and I would say we should never deviate from making sure that those two criteria are there, are in scenarios where we have increasingly, it's a tech company that come in and they just get access to the electronic health records of millions of patients, and they just see what they can discover. And then they say we should deploy it. There is no reasoning behind that is linked to sort of good quality critical thinking or good quality critical care thinking. And in those scenarios, I would always say we must have those criteria met. That's probably a little bit rambly, but essentially, no, I don't think they're always essential if there is good logical clinical thinking behind the idea of building the system in the first place.
You're not taking up at least one of the invitations that I was maybe putting in your mouth, and I just wanted to see if you really don't want to take it up. So you could say, hey, look, there are cases where even if the overall outcome is better, we shouldn't do it because of some non-utilitarian ethical justification. I didn't see you rise to that particular bait, and I wonder if that was on purpose.
It's a little bit on purpose in the sense that I haven't done sort of sufficient deep thinking about it, but my gut instinct, and this is purely based on sort of my existing thinking on this, not necessarily thinking about the question in depth, is yes, I think there are scenarios in which the outcomes, even if the outcomes are better, we are better off not deploying this type of software. I think in the overarching general principle is we have a sort of ethical duty of investigating technologies that have the potential for saving and improving lives in general. So that's the justification for investigating where and which they can be used. But I think there are some instances where exactly like you say, the sort of more utilitarian or the overarching importance of doing good care is potentially better or more important than focusing very specifically on a clearly definable outcome, in which case I think there are some human aspects of delivering good high quality care which would override the justification for using the software. But what those are and what the conditions of those things are, I haven't got an answer off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.